Early on the morning of April 19th, the violence in Nashville reached its climax with the dynamiting of a Negro home. This was the residence of Alexander Looby, a city councilman and leading Negro attorney.
He was our lawyer. He came to our defense when we were arrested that day, when we really needed something, and somebody had tried to kill him.
You could see the potential of the city for the first time destroying itself. You could see long years of good relations built up between Negroes and whites being destroyed by the struggle going on.
Well, I felt like that here were a group of youngsters that were outraged because their leader's home had been dynamited. And I felt outraged along with them. And to that extent, we had a community of feeling between us that made me have a feeling that really we were after the same thing, and that I was as outraged as they were by this horrible thing, and that the great majority of the thinking white people were outraged by such a thing. We just couldn't let a thing like that happen.
That was 1960. And here we are, 64 years later, and the bombing of Z. Alexander Looby's home in North Nashville remains unsolved. Even though Mayor Ben West, who you just heard, took over the investigation himself. Even though the FBI was also on the case. Writer Betsy Phillips has spent the better part of a decade now trying to figure out what happened and why we still don't have answers. She got FBI files, she dug through the Banner archives, she even drove down to Alabama to look through the personal papers of notorious segregationist Bull Connor. What Betsy found shocked her. There was no shortage of leads, even back in the 50s and 60s. And maybe, just maybe, the FBI's involvement is actually part of the reason these cases were never cracked. In her new book, Dynamite Nashville, Betsy explores the Looby bombing, both in the context of two other civil rights-era bombings in Nashville and in the larger context of racist terrorism across the American South. Because there was a network, and she would argue it's not entirely gone. I'm Demetria Kalodimos. It's Banner and Company.
The main thing I'm trying to do is solve 3 integration-era bombings that happened here in Nashville. Hattie Cotton's school was blown up in September 1957. Then the Jewish Community Center was blown up in March 1958. And then probably most famously, the home of Councilman Z. Alexander Looby was blown up in April of 1960. So those are the 3 bombings that I mainly focus on, but as you know, throughout the book, it expands to kind of look at this whole network of bombers who are working together throughout the South.
And all of those crimes still classified in 2024 as
right.
unsolved.
Right. Yeah, and that's really one of the heartbreaking things to me, is that every time the Justice Department opens up a civil rights era cold case and is like, shrug, well, there's no one left to talk to. So that is really, to me, like one of the frustrating things, is kind of that the lie is perpetuated. That, oh, well, we can't know what happened. There's no one left. Like, well, it's kind of your job is to find out what happened. For me, like, obviously there can't be justice, but we should at least have the truth.
Who's still alive with direct knowledge? I mean, we're talking about people pushing 95 plus.
Right. Well, so that to me is one of the more disturbing things because so J.B. Stoner, his best friend was Ed Fields, and they got together because of their mutual hatred for Jewish people. But Ed Fields had been terrorizing Atlanta since the 40s. He was a member of the Colombians, which was like an early like proto-neo-Nazi group. He was involved in Stoner's anti-Jewish party. Then he was like one of the leaders in the National States Rights Party. He was at the nexus of everything. I think in the book I call him, like the Forrest Gump of racist. He sold a gun to Ray, to King's assassin.
James Earl Ray.
Yeah, to James Earl Ray. Right? Like he just was. And the last I heard, he is still alive. I had a friend, a journalist from Chattanooga, and I said to him, I'm like, hey, Ed Fields, and this has been like 4 or 5 years ago, I said, Ed Fields is still alive. I can't get an interview with him, but here's his phone number. And he called down and talked to Ed's wife. And she would not let him talk to Ed. But one of the things she said that like deeply troubles me is she was in trying to convince my friend that Ed had changed his ways.
Of
She
course.
said, well, he told those boys that Charlottesville was the wrong approach. So I was like, here we are. And Ed Fields is not
still
only
advising.
still alive.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's still apparently, and maybe he's just calling them, maybe they're thinking of him as like some loony uncle who's like butting in when he's not wanted. But it means he still has these connections and and that was one of the things that I really hoped would be obvious in the book is that racists have a tradition and like, for lack of a better term, a heritage that they're very aware of. And they call on this like long history of racism to inspire each other. And so the fact that we let Nashville's bombings go unsolved has massive implications for now.
And there might be children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren who know well the people in these pages.
Yes, yeah.
And are having a hard time with it, but could supply information.
Right, exactly. Well, this is one of the most kind of frustrating things about Nashville is, people whose families are from here, they have been here for a long time. And yet, if you go to the civil rights room at the library, they know every Black person in those photos. If you haven't been to the civil rights room at the library, they have giant blown up photos from the banner hanging around the room. And they know the identities of every Black person in those photos because people come in and they're like, that's my grandpa, or, oh, that was my neighbor so-and-so, or whatever. Like, Black people know the Black people in those photos. And there must also be the equivalent of white people who would know who the white people in those photos are. But the last time that I talked to Elliot Robinson at the Civil Rights Room about this, he said no white person has ever come in to identify anybody. And this really hurts our ability to know what happened and why, or how this was decided and, who was involved. And certainly I understand the great amount of shame that there might be around this, but this is one of the ways to alleviate that shame by taking a stand to be on the right side by saying yeah, I know this person, or my mom went to church with this person, or whatever it is. No one's going to be prosecuted. Everyone's dead. Again, it's just a matter of the city deserves the truth.
There have been lots of unsolved crimes in this town, but none as glaring as the series of civil rights bombings in the late 50s and early 60s. We talk about the nonviolent tactics, born here, but we don't talk about all the violent things that were tolerated, if not ignored.
Right, right. And one of the points that I try to make in the book is that pretty much in the same way that this is where so many of those nonviolent tactics were worked out, this is also where racists were trying and figuring out how to be violent and not get caught. So doing this research and realizing like, whoa, if they had solved Hattie Cotton, these 12 other bombings certainly would not have happened. And like the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, that would have been more difficult for them to pull off because this network wouldn't exist. But instead, to just watch them turn their backs, like the FBI and the police, was really shocking.
Where did you start? How did you start?
Well, I started back the summer before the 60th anniversary of the Hattie Cotton bombing, because I just thought, like, it's about time. Like, as a city, we should be able to say, who did this? That seemed, like, I didn't expect, like, justice or anything to come of it, but I just thought, like, somebody knows, and we should just say it and get it out there so that Nashville can have the truth. But I thought, like, I'll just find the right gossip circle, because, like, down in Birmingham, everybody knew who those bombers were. They just couldn't, like, bring them to justice. But if you had gone down to Birmingham and said, who blew up the 16th Street Baptist Church, people would tell you names that then were going to end up being the people who were prosecuted for it. So I just assumed I'll just fall into the right gossip circle and I'll get these answers. I could not find the right gossip circle. And I was like, how do you keep this kind of secret for this long? And then I talked to Rachel Martin, who wrote that great book that just came out on Clinton, Tennessee. And she's like, start FOIAing, like, Freedom of Information Act requests to the FBI right now, because the process is going to be that they're going to tell you no. Then they're going to tell you, well, maybe, like, she's like, you need to, like, build in time for whatever weirdness they're going to do, which I'm really glad that she did, because I then just started. But again, because you don't know what any of this stuff is called, you have to, like, guess, like, can I have the file on this? And, oh, no files match your request. And you don't know if that's because the file doesn't exist or because you called it the Looby bombing file, but they called it Nashville bombing or something, So, like, that's really like playing hide and seek in the dark with an unfair opponent.
I'm Demetria Kalodimos. It's Banner and Company. We'll be right back. If you're interested in building a more thriving and inclusive community by turning thoughtful generosity into positive change, well, you might want to know about one of our sponsors here at Banner and Company, the Community Foundation of Middle Tennessee. It matches compassionate givers with worthy causes in ways that benefit all of us. Check them out at cfmt.org. Once the Hattie Cotton School was bombed in 1957, you did have an investigation.
Right.
And they started looking at people. But you write that there were some obvious folks that they neglected to even speak to. A guy named Jesse Wilson.
Right. Yeah.
What made him an obvious choice?
Right. So Jesse Wilson had been involved. He had committed some earlier bombings.
And gone to jail.
And gone to prison
for it, yeah.
over it, right. And these earlier bombings, one involved a former mayor. So that's a politician here in Nashville. He tried to blow up the home of the Tennessean's publisher, which, if I were the Tennessean, man, I would have never let that rest.
What a story.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly. And he had tried to... So my favorite thing about Jesse is the reason that he tried to bomb the home of the Tennessean's publisher is because he was upset over the coverage of his earlier crimes. He felt like they were not fair to him, that they made him seem like kind of like a yahoo. So he was, I guess, going to get real angry about it. But so, he was a known serial bomber who had been involved in some very messy court fights. He'd gone to prison. He just seemed like a really obvious first suspect. If you were floundering around for like, who could have done this, that you would look for the guy who has the public history of blowing stuff up. And yet they never talked to him, as far as I can tell.
And that was true of many, many people.
Yes, yeah.
What was going on?
Well, I think that there were two things going on. One was that the Nashville police just really wanted to nail somebody.
Right.
Quickly. They wanted to be able to tell Nashville, like, this is solved and done, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. But also, the FBI had decided that there were certain witnesses that the FBI had that they were not going to share with the Nashville police. So as it started to become obvious to the Nashville police that the FBI had more information than they were willing to share, I think we started to see this breakdown in the relationship between those two entities that then pretty much ensured that no bombing was going to be solved. There was just, you're withholding witnesses. Now we're lying to you about facts. Like, it was just a really bad, tense situation. And to me also, like, incredibly disturbing that the FBI was not that eager to solve these crimes.
I can recall initially looking at that file and going, just my jaw dropping, that the agencies were keeping secrets from one another.
Right, exactly. Well, and I'm sure, like, because I first saw this in your file, where you can see the FBI backdating memos so that it looks like they all along were keeping the Nashville police informed, when really they basically, the day after the bombing, were like, oh, crap. We better make it look like we told Nashville this was happening. So then it's their fault for not stopping it, as opposed to our fault for not stopping it.
And it didn't appear that the press at the time was on to any of this.
No, not at all. And, eventually the press did learn of Charles Reed, one of the FBI's informants. But as far as I can tell, no one knew about Thomas Norval. Like, my book will be the first time most Nashvillians ever hear of him.
And I don't want to be a spoiler, but give us a little nugget about him.
Right. So Thomas Norval was, I don't want to let him off the hook. He was a bad guy. He, worked hand in hand with Casper. He was a member of the KKK. But he was the guy who, when he heard about the plot to bomb Hattie Cotton, he went straight to the FBI. He tried to stop this. And he appears to have been the only person who knew this was going on, who did try to stop it. Everybody else was busy, like, oh, I saw the dynamite, or, oh, I heard that they might bomb Fair School, or whatever, like, chit-chatting. But he was the only one who was like, no, someone's got to take a stand against this. I don't know how history will see him, because on the one hand, he was the only person with like this bit of moral clarity. But on the other hand, I could see how from the perspective of like the racist or whatever, it's like, well, he was a sellout. He was a snitch.
I think it's super helpful for the reader that you reintroduce the cast of characters quite a bit before you delve into another chapter, because, gosh, there are so many names. Right. Vanderbilt's ties to segregationists. Donald Davidson. Who was he?
So Donald Davidson is probably best known as like one of the great poets of the South. He was a member of both the fugitive movement and the agrarian movement at Vanderbilt. And, he was friends with John Crow Ransom, Robert Penn Warren, pretty much everybody in that group.
Who's who? Yeah.
Yeah, just knew everybody and was incredibly influential. And he was running basically a high-class hate group, him and a bunch of Vanderbilt faculty and staff. So at the same time that Vanderbilt is gearing up to expel Lawson, Reverend Lawson, they are also turning a blind eye to the fact that segregationists in town are finding a ton of support from their racist faculty.
Wow. I know there was a letter written by a housewife to the governor at the time, Frank Clement, weeks before the Hattie Cotton school was bombed, and she's talking about, I don't want my child hurt at school, right?
Yes, and this was stunning to me. So this is Carrie Ray, and John Casper was staying at her house. So I'm sitting there at the Tennessee State Library and Archives just flipping through all of these letters to Governor Clement about school desegregation. And I thought that I was just going to get a flavor for how many folks, like what their thoughts were, like kind of their reasoning. And then here is this letter from Carrie Ray, whose name I knew because I knew John Casper was staying with her. And you read through this letter, and she is using phrasing that John Casper is then going to use in his speeches later on in August. So she sends this letter in like mid-August. He starts using those same phrases in late August. And the letter was disturbing enough that Governor Clement alerted the Department of Education, like, oh, hey, this weirdo. But there's nothing in the file to indicate that they turned it over to any law enforcement person. So raised enough red flags that he was like, someone should know about this, but not enough red flags for him to like turn it over to somebody who could have done something about it. And then even when John Casper started using these same phrases, and one of the things I get into in the book is that Carrie says that she, for one, is not going to send her kids to school because she doesn't want them to be hurt, which indicates to me that she knew that there was a plot that might injure white children.
Right.
Because otherwise, why would, like her kids, they're not in a integrating school. They're not, so like that to me was even more ominous reading through that because I had enough of Casper's plot at that point, and then seeing like, oh, wow, she is basically saying, like, and the governor, I don't, like, he got hundreds of letters, right? But, like, if he had turned that over to law enforcement, there was enough, in that letter, enough clues that I think that they might have been able to stop the bombing.
Tell us how they did it. I mean, early press accounts are like, oh, it was tossed from a car,
right,
etc. And there were 13 sticks or however many.
Right.
Ultimately,
right. So
how was it done?
Right. Ultimately, from what I've been able to piece together, and what they confessed to, which is like, maybe that's a spoiler, but there was actually like the doers were known in the Hattie Cotton case by January of 1958. It just never trickled out. But it was 3 guys, one of whom they did not know the identity of. Anybody doesn't seem to have known the identity of. But this was the kind of crew that J.B. Stoner was known to put together. So those 3 guys brought 13 sticks of dynamite to the school, covered those sticks of dynamite in dry concrete, and then ran a fuse. And then, so they were able to be like quite a length away from the dynamite when it blew up.
But this wasn't a like Coyote and Roadrunner light a match fuse. It was some sort of a button.
Yeah, it was a button that was attached to a battery. So, like they had, the thing about it was definitely complex enough to make you think like, oh, they've done this before. Or they, like...
They know what they're doing.
Right, exactly. And they know how far away they need to be and, like how to keep themselves safe while doing this. So, yeah. And so then the school blows up. The FBI tells the Nashville police, hey, we have this informant who says that this is how the bombing was done. And the Nashville police were like, well, that can't be true because there was no dry concrete on the scene. I was like, are we looking at the same pictures? Because Hattie Cotton was concrete block on the inside of the exterior wall and brick and mortar on the outside. So there's concrete dust, which is dry concrete, all over, everywhere. So how the Nashville, so that's a thing that I've wondered about, is like, the Nashville police were lying to the FBI, but those FBI agents were in town. They had been to the scene, so they knew the police were lying to them. So what, like, I think something was being communicated there, but I'm not entirely sure what. But it is definitely a weird thing to be reading through the FBI file, you know, when you've seen the photos, and have the FBI say, like, well, Nashville police says they didn't find any concrete dust, like any dry concrete, because it's like, that's all I see. It's dry concrete everywhere. Even the next day when they were taking those color slides that are now at Metro Archives, you can see the guy shoveling, and there's like poofs of dust coming off the shovel. Like, it was incredibly dusty. So really perplexing.
It's Banner and Company, and my guest is Betsy Phillips, author of Dynamite Nashville. We'll be right back. I was absolutely fascinated by some photos of a fellow who has a injured hand.
Yes.
Explain.
Right. So one of the suspects in this bombing was a man named Slim Thompson. And the KKK was actually really forthcoming with how they used him. He was from a little town just outside of Florence, Alabama, but he had family here in Nashville. And so whenever the Klan needed something blown up, they would go get him, bring him up here, let him do his thing, and then drive him home, so that there wasn't anybody here for the police to find. But his distinguishing characteristic was that he had, as a child, blown 3 of his fingers off in a dynamite accident. So he's missing. Now, the FBI said that he was missing his thumb, first finger, and middle finger. I believe they said on his left hand. And the pictures that I found
in the Banner Archives.
In the Banner Archives, exactly. Were on the other hand, but I don't, the FBI could have just been misinformed. But one of the things that I think is so interesting about this, as you know, because you have talked to Banner photographers about that, the Banner was taking photos for the police.
Instructed by police to, hey, get a shot of this guy, or...
Right, exactly. Which means that the Banner photographer, because there are multiple pictures of this man, so even the Banner photographer was like, oh, this is somebody that the police should be aware of, right? So like that, to me, I was like, oh, wow. This isn't just like a Banner photographer, like, this is a picture that I might run in the paper, because it never did run in the paper, right? He was like, this is a picture of somebody the police need to be aware of. So that was kind of vindicating, because I also thought that.
And it's great. It's not as if the guy has his hands in his pockets or is wearing gloves, and he's holding things up high so that you can see both hands. Yeah,
racist flyers. So it's like, you don't have any, if you're like, well, I don't know, maybe that was just a nice guy with no fingers. It's like, no, he's pretty clearly advertising that he's on the wrong side here.
And speaking of pictures, there was a photo that ended up in Life magazine.
Yes.
That you think, really screams out as a missed opportunity to potentially connect dots.
Right. So this photo was taken in 1954 by someone in Chattanooga, and I can't remember if it was at the Times or the Free Press, but those were at the time 2 separate papers. And then in 1958, after the Atlanta Temple blew up, they ran this photo because 2 of the bombers were in this photo that was taken in Chattanooga. I looked at that photo and I was like, okay, those are the two bombers who are identified, the Bowling brothers. And then that looks like it could be Ed Fields, who was J.B. Stoner's friend. And then it's clearly J.B. Stoner in the middle. And then on the right side of the picture are two guys. And they're, we're looking at like a fuzzy, ancient photo. But they look very much like Ken Adams, who was a Klan leader down in Anniston, Alabama, and Asa Carter, who ran a renegade Klan in North Alabama and then went on to be George Wallace's speechwriter. So while the FBI was saying early, like in the 57 and early 58, none of these bombings throughout the region are connected. We can't step in and do this investigation into all of these bombings throughout the South because there's no indication that this is an interstate crime. But in 1954, there's this photo in Chattanooga featuring a bunch of people who are known racist terrorists, none of whom lived in Chattanooga, which pretty clearly indicates to me that this was interstate from the start, that they knew each other, that they had this loose network. One of the other things I talk about in the book, to go back to Vanderbilt, is one of the things that Donald Davidson was doing was his hate group was like erudite upper class white people who didn't want to like sully their own reputations. So they would funnel money to the defense of Klan's people who were arrested, or they would bail them out or whatever. Or so they were like the money behind the movement, but they didn't ever have to like.
It's like the dark money of the day.
Exactly. Donald Davidson's right-hand man was Jack Kershaw. Now, he is probably best known now, if you remember the ugly Nathan Bedford Forrest statue that was south of town.
That
Jack
became
Kershaw,
pink?
Yes. Jack Kershaw carved that. He was also one of James Earl Ray's attorneys, as was J.B. Stoner. He was also one of the founders of the League of the South. The League of the South is, well, now they've kind of descended into like an angry motorcycle gang. But at the time of Charlottesville, they were kind of at the same level as the Sons of the Confederacy, where it was like, oh, these are just some eccentrics who can't let go of the past. But they were funneling money in the same way that Davidson had done to the Klan. The League of the South was funneling money to the racists at Charlottesville to help them get training and guns and ammunition and stuff. So this form of funding that Donald Davidson perfected in Nashville in the 50s, I think is what helped kill Heather Heyer in our lifetime, in our recent past. Like, I don't think you can get like the connection of just like this stuff that they figured out how to do here in Nashville is still effective and deadly to us today. Just shows like this isn't the past. This isn't even over. This is still like we're in a civil war most of us don't even know we're having. And yet we're still paying the price with this violence.
Banner and Company is a production of the New Nashville Banner. Our producers are Steve Haruch and Andrea Tudhope. Original music is by Verlin Thompson. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or go to NashvilleBanner.com. You're in good company. See our little fishbowl there?
Yes.
Questions from previous guests are contained within. So Pick one randomly and
All right.
give it your best shot. And then, of course, we'll ask you to pose one of a future guest.
Okay. This says, any
second thoughts about doing this?
Who's it from?
Macon Kimbrough. Yes, all the time. I haven't talked about this publicly, but a while back I got home and I heard this noise and I realized that my tire was like massively leaking air. And I was like feeling around on it to see, like, I was expecting a nail or something, and there was a knife blade in my tire. And I live up in Whites Creek. I drive on Clarksville Pike all the time, which was under construction for years. It is very likely that that was just road debris. But I could not, and still really can't shake the idea that, like, someone was in my garage. So, yeah, at that point when I was out, buying a million cameras and debating whether or not I should get a gun, and yeah, I really was like, why am I doing this? But then I was like, well, I'm already this far in. And if not me, then who? So, all right. But yeah, I had regrets. Hopefully, it will be okay. I tell Steve Cavendish all the time that he has to avenge me. I don't know if that's, so that's, yeah, like, if anything happens to me, y'all are stuck with Steve running around town trying to avenge me. And if you are either afraid of that for, like, fear reasons, or afraid of that because you will be embarrassed for him, then let's not do that.